They sent their blind, obese daughter as a joke, but the joke was on them. They laughed when the wagon pulled away, a cloud of dust swallowing the last of their shame. They were certain she'd be rejected at the gate, sent back like a faulty piece of mail. But when the dust settled on the Wyoming prairie, and the rancher looked into her sightless eyes, he didn't see a burden. He saw a weapon, a woman carved from truth, courage, and a silence that screamed louder than any lie. The sound of the wagon wheels was a hammer against stone, every jolt driving Clara deeper into the rough wooden boards. She clutched the thin shawl across her chest, but no fabric could shield her from the memory of their voices. Her sisters, their laughter like shattered glass. Her mother's final words, cold and sharp. Finally, someone else's problem. Her father hadn't even looked at her. He'd just pressed coins into the driver's hand and turned his back. Clara's hands trembled in her lap, her thick fingers knotting the fabric. She couldn't see the road stretching out before her, couldn't see the endless sky burning under the afternoon sun. But she could hear it. The wind, a lonely whisper across the plains. The horses' hooves, a slow, steady drumbeat of fate. Every sound painted a picture inside her head, clearer and more honest than sight had ever been. The driver cleared his throat, a nervous, gravelly sound. He wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Clara tilted her head, listening to his silence. She'd learned long ago that most men carry their true thoughts in the spaces between words. "You'll be fine," he finally muttered, but his tone was a lie. "He's a good man, they say. Elias Ward. Better than most." Clara nodded once, pressing her lips together. She wanted to believe him. But the fear in her heart was a cold, heavy stone. What if Elias sent her back? What if he laughed, just like her sisters had? What if this hardened rancher saw only what she'd been told she was her whole life? Too large, too broken, too blind to matter. The joke wasn't just that she was being sent to him. The joke was that she was completely, utterly worthless. The wagon creaked to a halt. Dust filled the air, gritty and sharp, and Clara's throat tightened. The driver's boots hit the ground with a thud. Then she heard it, the long, low groan of a wooden gate opening. A deep voice cut through the silence, low and steady as the earth itself. "You can bring her down." The words weren't cruel, they weren't mocking, but they carried a weight, an authority that came from years of solitude, from battling the land and winning. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her fingers found the edge of the wagon, her entire body tensed for the blow of rejection. She could hear his boots now, shifting in the dirt, the creak of leather as he moved closer. He was assessing her, she knew. She had felt that stare her whole life, the kind that measured, judged, and dismissed. The driver hesitated, then whispered, "Ma'am, he's waiting." He touched her elbow, and her breath caught. Slowly, carefully, she swung her legs over the side. Her worn shoes sank into the dust, unsteady at first, but then she straightened her spine, lifting her chin, even though she couldn't meet his eyes. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical pressure. But this was different. It wasn't the stare that stripped her down or mocked her size. It was heavy, yes, but it was searching, as if he was looking for something that had nothing to do with her eyes or her body, as if he was looking for the parts of her no one else had ever bothered to find. "What's your name?" His voice was softer now, closer. "Clara," she whispered, her throat raw. "Clara," he repeated, slow, as if testing the word in his mouth. "I'm Elias Ward." For the first time in years, Clara let herself raise her face fully, letting the prairie wind tug at her hair. Her family had always told her no man would ever say her name with pride. But this stranger, this Elias Ward, had spoken it like it was the beginning of something, not the end. He stepped closer, so close she could smell the leather, the horses, and the clean scent of soap He didn't touch her, didn't rush. His voice held steady. "You've had a long ride. Come inside. Supper's waiting." Supper. The word was so simple, but it cracked something open inside her chest. Her family hadn't sent her with a blessing, or a kind word, or even a piece of bread for the journey. They had sent her to starve. But this man, this stranger, was offering her a meal before he'd even decided her fate. The driver muttered a farewell, and the wagon wheels faded down the road, leaving her alone with him. Her small trunk sat abandoned by the gate. Her hands were empty at her sides. Elias didn't move away. His boots crunched in the dirt, closer now. Then, carefully, gently, his calloused hand brushed against hers. "Let me guide you," he said. His touch wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was solid, grounded. It was the touch of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And as his fingers wrapped around hers, a shocking thought sparked in Clara's mind. What if her family's cruel joke had accidentally sent her to the one place she was meant to be? Inside the small ranch house, every sound was a brushstroke on the canvas of her darkness. The scrape of a wooden chair on the floorboards, the low simmer of stew on the stove, the faint crackle of a fire in the hearth. The air was thick with the scent of meat, onions, and fresh bread, a comforting blanket she hadn't felt in years. Elias guided her to a chair, his hand never leaving hers until she was safely seated. "Eat first," he said, his voice firm. "We can talk later." Clara obeyed, her hunger a gnawing thing born of nerves and neglect. She lifted the spoon to her lips, tasted the rich, savory stew, and hot tears burned in her blind eyes. No one had ever cared if she'd eaten. No one had cooked for her, not since her grandmother died. Her family had treated her meals as an inconvenience, another mouth to feed. But this man was feeding her before asking for anything in return. He was treating her like a person, not a problem. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against bowls and the crackling fire. When they were finished, Elias took her bowl. He didn't say a word as he moved to the wash basin. Clara sat frozen, listening to the quiet, domestic sounds. It felt foreign, dangerous, like a trap she couldn't see. Kindness was a currency she didn't understand. "You're not what I expected," Elias said finally, his back still to her. Clara's stomach clenched. Here it was. The rejection, the punchline to the joke. She braced herself. He turned, and she could hear the shift of his weight on the floorboards. His voice dropped lower, a rumble that vibrated through her. "You're more." Her spoon, still clutched in her hand, clattered against the table. She couldn't stop the sob that escaped her lips, the tears that slid hot down her cheeks. She turned her face away, ashamed of her own weakness. But his hand was there, rough and steady, catching a tear with the pad of his thumb. "I don't know what lies your family told you," he said, his voice a low growl. "But they don't decide your worth, not on my land." Her body shook with the force of her grief. Every word he spoke was a blade, cutting into the deep wounds her family had carved into her soul. But somehow, those same words were also the thread stitching her back together. As the prairie night deepened and the coyotes howled in the distance, Clara felt something she had never known, the beginning of safety. But what she didn't know was that Elias Ward had a past filled with shadows. He wasn't just a simple rancher. He had a history, a feud that ran deeper than any well on this land. And her family, the Shaws, were at the very heart of it. Her arrival wasn't a coincidence. It was a catalyst. The cruel joke her family played had just delivered him the one thing he needed to settle a generations-old score. And Clara was standing right in the middle of a war she didn't even know had begun. The next morning broke with a sharp Wyoming air that felt clean and new. Clara sat at the small wooden table, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped coffee mug. Elias had been up before dawn. She'd heard his boots on the floor, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses outside, the creak of the barn door. It was a symphony of purpose, a steady rhythm that soothed the frayed edges of her nerves. For the first time, she hadn't woken to her mother's sharp rebukes or her sister's mocking laughter. Here, there was only a vast, peaceful silence. When Elias came back inside, he brought the smell of earth and cold, fresh air with him. "Coffee's still warm," he said, his tone gruff, but not unkind. Clara reached for the pot, her movements hesitant, but his hand was quicker. "Let me." He poured the steaming liquid into her mug, the sound a small act of grace that tightened her throat. "You're not used to that, are you?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on her. She froze. "What do you mean?" "Being helped." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. Her family had only ever helped her when her blindness became an inconvenience to them. Help was a transaction, a debt to be repaid with her silence and compliance. "Help was never free," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Elias said nothing at first. He simply placed the warm mug gently in front of her, guiding her hand to it. "It is here," he said finally. The simplicity of those 3 words cracked something deep inside her. The day passed in a blur of sensory discovery. Elias led her around the ranch, his words painting pictures for her mind's eye. He described the golden sway of the tall grass under the endless blue sky, the dark shapes of cattle moving across the distant hills. He placed a warm, freshly laid egg in her palm, its surface smooth and perfect. At the chicken coop, he guided her hand to brush against the soft feathers of a hen, and its startled flutter made her laugh out loud. The sound caught Elias off guard. He stopped, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks flush. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh," he murmured. He tilted his head, a strange look on his face. "I hope it's not the last." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning neither of them was ready to acknowledge. But as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of fire and blood, the shadows returned to Clara's mind. Her family's voices echoed on the wind. Burden, shame, joke. She clenched her hands into fists, her breath catching in her chest. Elias noticed. He always seemed to notice. "They sent you away for a reason, Clara," he said, his tone suddenly hard, edged with steel. "It wasn't a question. It wasn't just because you're blind. I want to know what it was." Clara's pulse hammered. If she told him, he would see the rot she came from. He would see her as tainted, dangerous. "You'll think less of me." He stepped closer, his presence a wall of heat and solid strength, grounding her. "Try me." The truth was a storm inside her, threatening to break free. She remembered the nights spent listening through the thin walls of her family home. Her father's hushed, frantic conversations about land deeds and water rights. Her mother's schemes to ruin their neighbors. Her sister's cruel gossip that destroyed reputations. She had heard it all, and worse, she had understood it. Her blindness had made them careless. They spoke freely in front of her, believing she was just a piece of furniture that couldn't see and therefore couldn't comprehend their wickedness. But she saw everything. "They said I saw too much," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of years of secrets. "Even without eyes, I saw their lies. The money they stole, the people they hurt, sending me here. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a way to hide their secrets, a way to be rid of the one person who knew the truth." Elias's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening like a coming storm. "So they thought they'd ruin us both," he muttered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. His hand found hers, his grip firm and steady. "But they miscalculated." Her breath hitched. "Why?" "Because what they see as a weakness, Clara, I see as a strength." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They sent me a witness, and that's something I've been waiting for a very long time." Before Clara could process his strange words, A new sound cut through the fragile twilight. The distant rumble of wheels on dirt. A wagon was approaching, fast. Elias stiffened instantly, his entire body going rigid. His hand dropped from hers, moving instinctively toward his side, where a pistol was holstered under his coat. Clara's skin prickled with a sudden, cold dread. She couldn't see, but she could feel the change in the air. The peace of the last 2 days had just shattered. "Stay inside," Elias commanded, his voice no longer gentle. It was the voice of a soldier preparing for battle. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. "Who is it?" Elias stared toward the horizon, where a plume of dust rose against the fading light. The outline of a heavy wagon grew sharper with every passing second. "Trouble," he said, his voice grim. "The kind your family promised would follow." But there was something else in his tone, something more than just concern. It sounded like recognition. It sounded like he'd been expecting this all along. The wagon drew closer, its heavy wheels grinding against stone and dirt, each turn sending a tremor through the ground that Clara felt in the soles of her feet. She stood frozen in the doorway of the small house, her fingers digging into the rough wood of the frame. She heard the rattle of harnesses, the angry huff of tired horses, and then the harsh laughter of men who carried violence in their voices like a loaded gun. Elias was already halfway to the gate, his broad shoulders set like a barricade against the dying light. His stance was calm, but Clara heard the steel in his voice when he called out, "That's far enough. State your business." His tone told her what his words did not. These men were not welcome. They were an invasion. A man's voice, smooth like oil over gravel, answered back, "Easy now, Ward. We heard you've taken in a bride, a Shaw girl. Just came to offer our congratulations." The way he said the word made it an insult. Another voice chimed in, rougher, crueler. "They said the Shaws finally got rid of their blind ox of a daughter. We had to see it for ourselves." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest as shame burned her cheeks hot. Her family's cruelty hadn't just followed her. It had raced ahead, spreading like a prairie fire. But beneath the shame, something else was rising. A raw, unfamiliar anger. A fire she had been forced to smother her entire life. Elias didn't flinch. His voice rolled out across the dusty yard, low and steady as thunder. "You'll mind your tongue on my land, or I'll cut it out for you." The men laughed, a loud, ugly sound meant to provoke, to dare him. Clara's knuckles turned white where she gripped the doorframe. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide in the darkness where their words couldn't find her. But something in Elias's voice held her rooted to the spot. It was the sound of a man who did not make idle threats. Boots crunched closer. One of the men spat, the sound sharp and contemptuous. "What's it to you, Ward? You got all this land, plenty of cattle? Why saddle yourself with damaged goods? Something her own family didn't even want." The silence that followed was taut and heavy, stretched thin like a wire about to snap. Then Elias answered, his voice quiet but carrying a terrifying intensity. "Because her family is blind. They look at her and see a burden. I look at her and see a queen." The men fell silent, muttering amongst themselves, shifting uneasily. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He hadn't said it for them. He had said it for her. One of the men barked a laugh, but it sounded thin now, forced. "We'll see how long that pretty talk lasts when her father comes calling. Charles Shaw doesn't like loose ends." "Then he can come," Elias growled, taking a step forward, the sound of his boots pressing into the earth like a final warning. "And he can find out what happens when you try to take what's mine." The wagon turned, the horses groaning as they were yanked around. The men's laughter faded as they rode off into the twilight, but their threat lingered in the air like poison. Clara's knees buckled, and she sagged against the doorframe, her body shaking. A moment later, Elias was there, his strong hands steadying her. She flinched at his touch, then melted into his grasp, pressing her face against the solid wall of his chest. His heartbeat was a wild drum in her ear. "They'll be back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My father." "Let him come," Elias said, his voice a raw promise. "I'm not afraid of them, and you don't need to be either. Not anymore." Her fingers clutched at his dusty shirt. Tears she refused to shed for her family now burned her sightless eyes. "You don't understand," she choked out. "They didn't just send me away because they were ashamed. They sent me away because I have something they want back. Something I took." Elias's arms tightened around her, his whole body going tense. He pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face. "What did you take, Clara?" Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "Proof. A ledger book. It details every crooked land deal, every bribe, every life they've ruined to build their empire, including how they plan to take this ranch." Elias went utterly still. The air crackled around them. For a long moment, he said nothing, his thumbs just stroking her cheeks. The prairie night swallowed their words, but the terrible truth of them remained. This wasn't just about protecting a rejected woman. This was about a war for survival. And Clara hadn't just brought her shame to his doorstep. She had brought the key to winning, or losing, everything. And Elias's quiet, intense gaze suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. He hadn't been surprised by trouble's arrival. He had been waiting for it. "Where is it?" Elias asked, his voice low and urgent, all pretense of simple kindness gone. It was replaced by the sharp, focused intensity of a commander. "This ledger, where is it?" Clara trembled, the cold night air suddenly biting through her thin dress. "In my trunk," she whispered. "Sewn into a false bottom. They were so sure I was helpless they never thought to check." He swore under his breath, a sharp, violent sound. He guided her back inside, his grip on her arm firm, almost painful. He settled her into a chair by the hearth and began to pace, the thud of his boots on the wooden floor a restless, angry rhythm. The calm rancher was gone. In his place was a man coiled tight with a tension that seemed years in the making. "They won't just come back with threats, Clara," he said, stopping in front of her. "They'll come back to burn this place to the ground to get that book." "I know," she whispered. "I shouldn't have brought this trouble to you. My father—" "Your father," Elias interrupted, his voice laced with a venom that startled her, "is a thief and a murderer. I know exactly what Charles Shaw is capable of." Clara's head snapped up. "How? How do you know that?" Elias knelt before her, taking her hands in his. His were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "This land," he began, his voice dropping. "This ranch, it wasn't always mine. It belonged to another family. A good family. The Wards. My family. Charles Shaw wanted the water rights that run through this valley. My father wouldn't sell, so Shaw ruined him. He forged documents, bribed officials, and spread lies until my father lost everything. The shame killed him. My mother died a year later. I was just a boy." The story poured out of him, a torrent of old pain and fresh fury. He had spent the last 20 years working, saving, fighting to buy back this very piece of land, the heart of his family's legacy. He had rebuilt the ranch from nothing, all while watching Charles Shaw build an empire on the bones of honest men. "I knew Shaw's ambition wouldn't stop," Elias continued, his grip tightening on her hands. "I knew one day he'd come for this ranch again. I've been preparing for it. When the marriage broker told me Charles Shaw was offering his daughter, I thought it was a trap, a way to get a spy inside my home. I accepted because I wanted to see his move, to face him on my own terms." Clara's mind reeled. The pieces were slamming together with brutal clarity. Her arrival wasn't a joke that had turned into a blessing. It was a strategic move in a long-running war. "But I was expecting one of your sisters," Elias admitted, his voice softening as he looked at her face, her sightless eyes. I was expecting someone cruel and calculating like him. I wasn't expecting you. I wasn't expecting someone who had suffered at his hands even more than I had. And I sure as hell wasn't expecting you to be carrying the very weapon I need to destroy him. He stood up abruptly, the energy crackling off him. They sent you here to be a pawn in their game, Clara. But they made a mistake. They didn't send a pawn. He reached down and pulled her to her feet, his hands on her shoulders, his gaze so intense it felt like she could see it. They sent a queen. A knock on the door, sharp and sudden, made them both jump. It wasn't the loud, aggressive pounding of her father's men. It was quieter, more hesitant. Elias moved to the door, his body shielding Clara, his hand resting on the pistol at his side. He opened it a crack. A young man stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, his face pale in the moonlight. Clara recognized his voice instantly. It was Jed, one of the ranch hands Elias had hired for the season. "Sorry to bother you, boss," Jed stammered, his eyes darting from Elias to Clara and back again. "But I saw the wagon. I heard the threats. And there's something you need to see, down by the north fence line." Elias exchanged a dark look with Clara. "What is it, Jed?" "The well, boss," Jed said, his voice trembling slightly. "Someone's poisoned it, and the water flows straight to the cattle troughs. By morning, everything on this ranch could be dead." The storm broke 2 nights later, but it didn't come with men and wagons. It came with fire. The wind howled across the prairie, carrying a smell Clara could not mistake. Smoke. Acrid and hungry. She bolted upright in her small bed, her heart seizing in her chest. Outside, the horses were screaming, a terrifying sound of panic and pain. Boots pounded against the porch. Elias's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the roar of the wind and flames. "Jed, get the other men! Water buckets, now!" He burst into her room, his face illuminated by the flickering orange glow from the window. "The barn's on fire, Clara. Stay inside. Lock the door." But she had learned that trouble never listened to commands. She was already on her feet, her hands searching for the wall, her mind racing. This wasn't random. It was a message, a brutal, fiery warning from her father. He was done with threats. He was moving on to destruction. She could hear the chaos outside, men shouting, the panicked bellows of trapped cattle, the terrifying roar as the fire consumed the dry timber of the barn. She followed the sounds, her bare feet finding their way to the front door. She had to help. She couldn't just cower inside while Elias fought to save the life he had built, the life he was now sharing with her. She stepped out onto the porch, and the heat hit her like a physical force. The air was thick with smoke that burned her lungs and made her eyes water, even though they could not see the flames. "Clara, get back inside!" Elias yelled, his figure a silhouette against the inferno as he wrestled with a terrified horse, trying to lead it to safety. "I can help," she shouted back, her voice raw. "How?" he yelled, his frustration and fear evident in his voice. "The horses! I can calm them!" In her old life, the stables were her only refuge. She understood the language of animals better than she understood the cruelties of men. She moved toward the sounds of panic, her hands outstretched, her voice a low, soothing murmur. The horses, crazed with fear, were bucking and kicking. But as she got closer, speaking to them in a soft, steady tone, one of them quieted. It snorted, its hot breath washing over her hands, but it allowed her to grab its halter. Slowly, patiently, she led it away from the burning barn, her voice a constant, calming presence in the chaos. She went back for another, and then another. Elias and his men, their faces black with soot, worked desperately to contain the blaze, but it was a losing battle. The barn, and all the hay stored for winter, was going to be a total loss. By the time the sun began to rise, the fire had burned itself out. The barn was a smoldering skeleton against the pale dawn sky. The air stank of ash and despair. Elias stood staring at the wreckage, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. The ranch hands were scattered, tending to burns and calming the last of the spooked livestock. Jed approached Elias, his face grim. "We lost half the winter feed, boss, and 3 calves. This will ruin us." He shot a dark, suspicious look toward Clara, who was gently stroking the neck of a trembling mare. Things were quiet here until she showed up. Elias's head snapped around, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Don't you dare," he growled. "This isn't her fault. This is Charles Shaw's doing. She saved more than a dozen horses tonight. That's more than you can say." Jed flinched but held his ground. "How do we know that? How do we know she isn't a Trojan horse? Sent here to bring you to your knees so her father can just sweep in and pick up the pieces?" Clara froze, Jed's words striking her with the force of a branding iron. It was the same accusation she had lived with her whole life, that her blindness, her very presence, was a source of ruin. The trust she had just started to build felt like it was turning to ash along with the barn. "That's enough, Jed," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Clara could feel it in the air, in the sudden silence of the other ranch hands. They were looking at her, she knew, wondering, accusing. Later that day, as Clara was sweeping the ash from the porch, she overheard Elias and Jed talking in low, tense voices near the ruined barn. "It doesn't make sense," Jed argued. "Shaw is smart. A fire is messy, unpredictable. Poisoning the well was a direct hit at your cattle, your livelihood. This feels different." "It's a warning," Elias insisted. "Or a diversion," Jed countered. "What if the fire wasn't the main event? What if it was meant to draw us all out, to distract us while someone did something else?" Clara's blood ran cold. A diversion. Her hand tightened on the broom handle. Jed was right. Her father was a creature of calculation, not chaos. A fire was too public, too wild. It wasn't his style. Her mind raced, sifting through the sounds and smells of the chaotic night, the shouting, the screaming horses, the roar of the fire, and something else. A smaller sound she had registered, but dismissed in the panic. The scrape of a boot on the floorboards inside the house, while they were all outside fighting the fire. She dropped the broom and rushed inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She went straight to her room, to the small wooden trunk at the foot of her bed. Her fingers fumbled with the latch. She threw it open. Her meager belongings were tossed about, disheveled. She ripped at the lining at the bottom of the trunk, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her fingers searched the hollow space beneath. It was empty. The ledger was gone. A wave of icy dread washed over her. She sank to her knees, the world tilting. The fire hadn't been an attack. It had been a cover. While they were all distracted, fighting for their lives and their livelihood, someone had slipped into the house and stolen the one piece of evidence that could have saved them. Her father hadn't just sent a warning, he had disarmed them completely. She heard Elias and Jed come inside, their boots heavy on the floor. "Clara?" Elias called out, his voice laced with concern. She couldn't answer. A dry sob caught in her throat. He found her there, kneeling on the floor amidst the wreckage of her belongings, her face a mask of utter despair. "It's gone," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Elias, the ledger, it's gone." Jed let out a harsh breath from the doorway. "I knew it," he muttered, more to himself than to them. She was the diversion. Elias ignored him. He knelt in front of Clara, his hands gentle on her shaking shoulders. "Clara, look at me." She lifted her face, her sightless eyes filled with tears. "Did you see anything? Hear anything?" "No, yes," she stammered, trying to piece it together. "I heard something." Inside the house, during the fire, a footstep, just one. I thought it was one of the men. It wasn't, Jed said grimly from the door. We were all at the barn. Every last one of us. A heavy silence descended on the small room. The truth was undeniable. Someone had betrayed them. Someone on the inside. One of Elias's own men had set the fire and used the chaos to steal the ledger for Charles Shaw. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. He was already inside their home. Who? Elias whispered, his voice a raw, ragged thing. Clara shook her head, her mind a whirlwind of fear and suspicion. It could have been anyone. All the ranch hands were new, hired for the season, men drifting through, their pasts unknown, their loyalties for sale to the highest bidder. Her father could have paid any one of them. Jed's suspicion, once directed at her, now shifted, his eyes narrowing as he thought about the other men. There's Sam, he said slowly. He's been quiet the last few days, jumpy, and Pete. He lost a lot of money in a card game last week. He was desperate. Elias rose to his feet, his face a mask of cold fury. Get them, all of them. Meet me in the main house in 5 minutes. Jed nodded and left, his boots pounding down the hall. Elias turned back to Clara, his expression unreadable. The trust between them, so new and fragile, was being tested by fire and betrayal. He had every reason to believe Jed's initial accusation, that she had orchestrated the whole thing. He extended a hand and pulled her to her feet. You will be there too, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. This concerns you more than anyone. 5 minutes later, the small living room was crowded with the 5 ranch hands, Elias, Jed, and Clara. The men were dirty and exhausted from fighting the fire, their faces smudged with soot and confusion. They shifted nervously under Elias's thunderous gaze. Clara stood beside the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, listening. She couldn't see their faces, but she could hear the subtle shifts in their breathing, the nervous shuffling of their feet, the way the air grew thick with lies. One of you is a traitor, Elias said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. One of you set fire to my barn last night, and while the rest of us were fighting it, you snuck into this house and stole something that belongs to my wife. A chorus of denials erupted, the men all talking over one another. It wasn't me, boss. I swear on my mother's grave. Elias held up a hand, and the room fell silent. The liar among you will regret it, he promised, his voice dangerously soft. He started with the first man, Pete, the gambler. He questioned him, his voice relentless, trying to break him down. But Pete's denials were steady, his fear sounding genuine. He moved to the next man and the next. Each one swore his innocence. Clara closed her eyes, tuning out the words and focusing on the sounds beneath them, the cadence of their voices, the rhythm of their breathing. Her father had once mocked her heightened senses, calling her a listening creature. But now, that curse was her only weapon. She listened to Pete's rapid, shallow breaths of real panic. She listened to the low, steady rumble of another man's genuine confusion. She listened to Sam, the quiet one. His denial was firm, his voice even. But his heartbeat. She could almost hear it. It was too slow, too controlled. The heart of a man trying desperately not to give himself away. And then she smelled it. Faint, almost undetectable beneath the stench of smoke that clung to all of them. A sweet, cloying scent. The cheap tobacco her father always smoked. It was coming from Sam. It's him, Clara said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through another denial. All eyes turned to her. What? Elias asked. It's Sam, she repeated, turning her head in his direction. He smells of my father's tobacco, and his heart is beating too slowly. He's lying. Sam scoffed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. That's crazy. She's blind. What could she possibly know? She knows more than you think, Elias said, his eyes locking onto Sam. He strode over to the man, who instinctively took a step back. "Empty your pockets. I ain't gotta—" Sam started to say, but Elias's hand shot out and grabbed the front of his shirt, lifting him onto his toes. "Now!" Elias snarled. With trembling hands, Sam emptied his pockets onto the table. A pocket knife, a few coins, a lint-covered piece of candy, and a small, leather pouch of tobacco. Elias picked it up and held it out. "I don't smoke," Jed said instantly. None of the other men claimed it. Elias opened the pouch and sniffed it. His eyes narrowed. He looked at Clara, who nodded slightly. It was the same smell. Sam's composure finally broke. "He paid me," he blurted out, his eyes wide with fear. "Shaw. He paid me $200, said all I had to do was set a small fire for a distraction and get the book from the trunk. He said no one would get hurt." Rage, pure and cold, contorted Elias's face. In one swift movement, he threw Sam toward the door. "Get off my land," he hissed. "If I ever see your face again, I will bury you." Sam scrambled to his feet and fled, disappearing into the daylight. The room was silent, the remaining men staring at Clara with a new, awestruck respect. She had done what Elias's interrogation could not. She had uncovered the traitor. Jed stepped forward, his face filled with shame. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. "Clara, I was wrong to suspect you. I'm sorry." "It's all right, Jed," she said, her voice shaking slightly. The victory felt hollow. They had found the traitor, but the ledger was still gone. Her father had won. "No," Elias said, as if reading her thoughts. "He hasn't won yet." He turned to her, a new, desperate plan forming in his eyes. "He has the book, Clara. But you are the book. You heard it all. You know the names, the dates, the amounts. You are the witness. We don't need the paper, we just need you." A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than any before, seized Clara. He was right. The knowledge was locked inside her head, and that made her infinitely more valuable and more dangerous than a book. Her father wouldn't stop at fire and theft now. To silence her, he would have to destroy her. The next few days passed in a tense, watchful quiet. Elias and his men worked tirelessly to clear the wreckage of the barn, their movements efficient and grim. They were fortifying the ranch, boarding windows, checking rifles, preparing for a siege. The trust between them and Clara was now forged in fire and betrayal. They no longer saw her as a burden. They saw her as the heart of their defense, the woman whose mind held the key to their survival. Clara, in turn, refused to be a liability. She spent hours with Elias, painstakingly recalling every detail from the ledger: names of swindled ranchers, dates of fraudulent claims filed with the land office, the secret account numbers where her father hid his stolen money. She painted a verbal map of his crimes, her memory a flawless, damning record. As she spoke, Elias wrote it all down, creating a new ledger from the ashes of the old one. "This is good, Clara," he would murmur, his hand often finding hers in the quiet moments. "This is more than enough to expose him." But exposure required an audience. Their little ranch was an island in a vast empty prairie. The nearest town was a day's ride, and its sheriff, a man named Brody, was known to be in her father's pocket. They were isolated, outgunned, and running out of time. They all knew Charles Shaw would not let this new evidence exist for long. The attack came at dusk. Not with a single wagon, but with a dozen riders cresting the hill, their forms dark silhouettes against the blood-red sunset. At the lead was her father, Charles Shaw, and beside him the bloated figure of Sheriff Brody, a silver star glinting on his chest. "They're here," Jed called from the roof of the house where he stood watch. Elias met Clara in the main room, pressing a small pistol into her hand. Her fingers recoiled at the cold, heavy steel. "I've never—" "You just have to point and pull the trigger," he said, his voice grim. "Don't let them take you alive, Clara. You know what he'll do. He didn't have to elaborate. She knew her father's cruelty intimately. Silence was his goal, and he would achieve it by any means necessary. Elias and his 4 men took up positions at the windows. Clara crouched by the hearth, out of the line of fire, the unfamiliar weight of the gun in her trembling hand. She could hear the riders surrounding the house, the jingle of harnesses, the low, confident laughter. They had them trapped. "Elias Ward!" Sheriff Brody's voice boomed across the yard. "You are harboring a fugitive. My men and I have a warrant for the return of Clara Shaw to her legal guardian, her father." "She is my wife," Elias yelled back through the boarded window. "She is not a fugitive, and you are a corrupt dog on Shaw's leash. This is my land, and you are not welcome here." "Don't be a fool, Ward," her father's voice cut in, smooth and venomous. "This has nothing to do with you. It's a family matter. Give me the girl, and we will leave you and your pathetic ranch in peace." "That's a lie!" Clara screamed, her voice cracking. "He wants to silence me. He'll burn this place down either way." A tense silence followed. Then her father laughed. It was the sound that had haunted her nightmares her whole life. "You hear that, Ward? The little mouse has found its roar. It seems you've been a poor influence. I'll have to correct that." The first gunshot shattered the evening quiet. Glass exploded from a window, and the battle began. The air filled with the deafening crack of rifles, the splintering of wood, the whizzing of bullets. Clara pressed herself against the stone of the hearth, her ears ringing, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would burst. She could hear Elias and his men shouting, firing, reloading. She heard a cry of pain from one of the ranch hands, then Jed's voice cursing. The assault was relentless. They were hopelessly outnumbered. It was only a matter of time before Shaw's men broke through. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow, then another. They were using a log as a battering ram. Elias scrambled over to her, his face grimed with gunpowder, a dark slash of blood on his cheek. "They're breaking through," he said, his breath coming in harsh gasps. "There's a root cellar under the floorboards in the kitchen. Jed will show you. Go. Hide. No matter what you hear, do not come out." "No!" she cried, clutching his arm. "I won't leave you. You must. As long as you are safe, we have a chance. The testimony you wrote down. It's hidden, but it's worthless without you to verify it. You are the only thing that matters, Clara. Go." He pressed a desperate kiss to her forehead, then pushed her toward Jed. Jed grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the kitchen as the front door splintered and crashed inward. Men poured into the house, their faces twisted with violence. Jed shoved Clara toward a loose section of the floor, pulling it up to reveal a dark, gaping hole. "Get in!" he hissed, pushing her toward the ladder. She scrambled down into the damp, earthy darkness as Jed slammed the floorboards back into place above her. She heard the scrape of a heavy flour sack being dragged over the trapdoor. Plunged into absolute blackness, she could only listen as the sounds of the fight raged above her. The crash of furniture, the roar of guns, the shouts of men. She heard her father's voice bellowing orders. "Find her! Search every inch of this hovel!" Then she heard Elias cry out in pain, a terrible guttural sound that ripped through her soul. Her blood ran cold. She clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Footsteps thudded on the floorboards directly above her head. They were searching the kitchen. A heavy crate was kicked aside. Her heart stopped. They were seconds away from finding her. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos from outside. A single, powerful gunshot, different from the others, followed by a loud, authoritative voice. "Charles Shaw, drop your weapons. You are surrounded by federal marshals." The fighting inside the house abruptly stopped. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Clara could hear her father's shocked, sputtering denial. "Marshals, what is this? Brody, do something!" "It's over, Shaw," the new voice said, now inside the house. "We have a signed deposition, a full account of your crimes, forgery, extortion, murder, the testimony of Clara Ward. Clara's mind struggled to understand. The testimony of Clara Ward? But she was down here. The document Elias had written was hidden. How could they have it? The flour sack was dragged away and the trapdoor was ripped open. Light streamed in, blinding her. A man in a dusty coat with a marshal's badge pinned to it looked down at her. "Ma'am, are you Clara Ward?" She could only nod, speechless. "It's safe to come out now." As she climbed out of the cellar, the scene in the living room was one of carnage and chaos. Her father and his men, including Sheriff Brody, were being held at gunpoint, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. Wounded men from both sides were groaning on the floor. Her eyes darted around, desperately searching. She saw Jed, leaning against a wall, a bloody bandage on his arm, but alive. She saw the other hands, bruised but standing. Then she saw Elias. He was on the floor, propped up against the wall, his shirt soaked with blood from a wound in his side. He was pale, but his eyes were open, and they were fixed on her. "Elias!" she cried, rushing to his side. He managed a weak smile. "I told you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They miscalculated." The lead marshal knelt beside them. "We've been investigating your father for months, ma'am. We had whispers, rumors, but never any hard evidence. Then 3 days ago, a telegraph arrived at our field office. It was a full confession, detailing dozens of his crimes." He paused, looking from Elias to Clara. "It was signed with your name, ma'am. Sent from the station in Rock Creek." Clara stared at Elias, her mind reeling. Rock Creek was a 2-day ride away. 3 days ago. That was the morning after the fire. While she had been sleeping, exhausted from the ordeal, and while she and everyone else believed he was working to clear the wreckage, Elias had been gone. He had ridden like the devil was on his heels, not to chase after the stolen ledger, but to become the ledger himself. He had memorized everything she had told him, every name, every date. He had ridden to the nearest telegraph station, not controlled by her father's influence, and sent the entire story out into the world under her name, forcing the marshals to act. He had gambled everything on a desperate, long-shot plan, knowing he might not make it back before her father attacked. He had bet his life on her words. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she clutched his hand. "You rode all that way. You could have been killed." "It was the only way," he rasped, his eyes fluttering. "Had to make sure. Your voice was heard." As the marshals dragged her father away in chains, he shot her one last look of pure, unadulterated hatred, but it had no power over her anymore. His empire of fear and lies had been brought down, not by a gun or an army, but by the memory of a blind woman he had thrown away like trash. Weeks later, Elias was recovering, his wound healing slowly but surely. The ranch was being rebuilt, not just by Jed and the other hands, but by neighboring ranchers who, freed from Shaw's tyranny, came to offer their help and their gratitude. They looked at Clara not with pity, but with a deep, abiding respect. She was no longer Clara Shaw, the blind burden. She was Clara Ward, the woman who had brought justice to the valley. One evening, as they sat together on the rebuilt porch, watching the stars prick the vast, dark canvas of the Wyoming sky, Elias took her hand. "They thought they were playing a cruel joke," he said quietly, his voice strong again. "But what they sent me was the only thing I'd ever really been missing." He brought her hand to his lips. "You." In the quiet of the prairie night, Clara realized the truth. Her family's cruelty hadn't been her end. It had been her beginning. It had delivered her not into shame, but into the arms of the one man who had been waiting for her his entire life, even if neither of them had known it. The world had mocked her, but love had rewritten the story. The joke had become the ultimate blessing. The blind daughter had become the heart and the vision of a man who had everything but love, and a rancher who had nothing but hope. Together, they had everything. If this story of courage and unexpected love moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story. And let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support means everything, and together, we'll keep sharing stories that prove that the people the world casts aside are often the ones who hold the most strength.